Number 10. The lead mask's case. Some dark events become legendary because they look violent, while others become legendary because they look as though reality itself has been arranged according to a logic no one can decode. The lead mask's case belongs to that second and more unsettling category of modern mystery. In 1966, 2 men were found dead on a hill in Brazil, dressed in suits, wearing waterproof coats, and most disturbingly of all, accompanied by homemade lead eye masks. Nearby were strange notes, unusual instructions, and details that made the scene feel less like an ordinary crime or accident, and more like the remains of some private ritual whose meaning died with the participants. That is what gave the case such lasting force. It did not merely leave bodies behind, it left behind a pattern. The visual structure of the scene is what continues to haunt people. Death is disturbing enough on its own, but mystery deepens when the dead appear to have been following instructions known only to themselves. The lead masks made the case unforgettable because they felt both practical and bizarre, as though the men were preparing for an event that required shielding the eyes from something dangerous or transcendent. That single image transformed the case from tragedy into modern legend. If the masks had not existed, the event might have settled into the category of unexplained death. But once the bodies were discovered with objects so unusual and so deliberate, the entire incident became charged with a sense of hidden purpose no investigation ever managed to fully recover. Naturally, explanations emerged. Some believed the men had been involved in spiritualist practices, experimental rituals, or attempts to contact other realms of perception. Others proposed poison, misadventure, fraud, or a meeting with someone whose role in the case was never fully exposed. But the deeper reason the lead mask's case endures is that none of these explanations feels emotionally complete. The facts appear real, yet the meaning behind them remains inaccessible. Modern legends thrive in exactly that gap. We can list the objects, reconstruct the timeline, and repeat the witness details, but the central question remains intact. What were they expecting to happen on that hill, and why did they go there dressed as though they believed the event had already been prepared? What keeps the lead mask's case alive is that it reveals one of the darkest possibilities in modern mystery. Not all terrifying events are terrifying because they involve open violence. Some are terrifying because they suggest human beings can move willingly towards something incomprehensible, guided by beliefs, instructions, or expectations that leave behind only fragments once everything goes wrong. The case still feels wrong because it carries the atmosphere of an unfinished ceremony, a private logic interrupted by death before it could be explained. That is why it remains so powerful. The bodies were real, the hill was real, the masks were real, and yet the reason for any of it still seems to stand just outside the reach of history. Number 9. The Black Dahlia murder. Some crimes become legendary because they are famous, but others become legendary because the violence was so deliberate, so theatrical, and so unresolved that it seemed to transform one murder into something larger than a single case. The Black Dahlia murder belongs to that darker category of modern legend. In 1947, the body of Elizabeth Short was found in Los Angeles in a state so shocking that the crime immediately entered the realm of public obsession. The case was not only brutal, it was staged in a way that made the murder feel coldly intentional, as though someone had wanted not merely to kill, but to leave behind an image that the city would never forget. That is what gave the case its enduring force. It did not remain a homicide. It became a symbol of modern urban dread. The setting mattered almost as much as the crime itself. Post-war Los Angeles already carried a split personality, glamour above, darkness below, a place of ambition, performance, and reinvention resting uneasily over corruption, exploitation, and hidden violence. The Black Dahlia case seemed to crystallize all of that in one event. The victim quickly became more than a person in public memory, and that transformation is part of what makes the case so haunting. Modern legends often grow when the real human center of a tragedy is surrounded by media spectacle, rumor, and the hunger for a narrative larger than truth. In this case, the murder did not merely terrify. It invited endless reconstruction, endless suspicion, and endless projection. Suspects, theories, confessions, and speculation have surrounded the case for decades, yet the mystery remains resistant to final closure. That uncertainty matters because when a crime is famous enough, the lack of resolution becomes part of the horror. The mind keeps returning to the same terrible point. Someone committed an act of extreme violence, left behind a scene designed to shock, and then moved forward into history without being decisively brought into the light. The city continued, newspapers continued, life continued, but the unanswered center of the case remained untouched. That is how an event hardens into legend. It ceases to belong only to investigation and begins belonging to atmosphere, memory, and cultural fear. What keeps the Black Dahlia murder alive is not only the brutality of the act, but the way it exposed something profoundly modern and profoundly disturbing. It suggested that beneath the surface of a world built on image, desire, and public fantasy, there could exist a form of violence equally shaped by image, equally deliberate, and equally impossible to forget. The case still unsettles because it refuses to become ordinary history. It remains a wound preserved in black and white photographs, newspaper columns, and unanswered questions. A crime so intensely documented and yet so unresolved that it continues to feel less like a solved past event than like a permanent opening in the mythology of the modern city. Number 8. The Max Headroom broadcast. Intrusion. Some dark events become legendary because they involve death, disappearance, or physical violence, but others become legendary because they strike something more abstract and more modern. The fragile assumption that our systems of communication are stable, controlled, and sealed against intrusion. The Max Headroom broadcast intrusion belongs to that category of unease. In 1987, viewers in Chicago witnessed one of the strangest acts of media hijacking ever recorded when television signals were interrupted by a masked figure resembling the fictional character Max Headroom, speaking and behaving in ways that were absurd, chaotic, and deeply unsettling. That is what gave the incident such unusual power. It did not merely interrupt a broadcast, it interrupted trust. For a brief moment, something unauthorized entered the machinery of the modern world and turned it into a stage for nonsense that felt disturbingly deliberate. What makes the intrusion so haunting is the tone of the footage itself. It is not simply criminal and it is not simply humorous. It occupies an uncanny middle ground where ridicule, performance, and menace begin to overlap. The masked figure moves and speaks with a kind of deranged theatricality, while the technical fact of the interruption makes everything feel more invasive than a prank should. That is important because modern legends often emerge when an event seems small in practical terms, but symbolically enormous. No one had to die for the case to become disturbing. The deeper fear came from the realization that the public signal, the invisible structure carrying familiar voices and authority into people's homes, could be seized and warped into something alien without warning. Investigators were never able to publicly identify and prosecute the people responsible, and that unresolved status is part of what keeps the case alive. If the culprits had been quickly exposed, the event might have settled into local media history as a bizarre but contained act of sabotage. Instead, the anonymity endured, and anonymity is fertile ground for legend. The mind begins to ask not only who did it, but how, why, and what it means that they were able to do it at all. Those questions matter because the incident occurred in a world increasingly defined by mediated experience. The interruption felt like a crack in the screen through which something uninvited briefly entered. What keeps the Max Headroom intrusion haunting is that it revealed a distinctly modern vulnerability. The world did not become terrifying because a monster appeared. It became terrifying because the systems people trusted to define reality suddenly became permeable. In that sense, Tliki, the case belongs to a newer kind of dark legend, one tied not to forests, ships, or isolated roads, but to signal, image, and technological unease. It remains powerful because it showed that the modern world can be destabilized not only by catastrophe, but by absurd intrusion performed at exactly the right frequency. The figure was ridiculous, but the event was not. Beneath the surreal costume and fragmented speech was a chilling lesson. Even the most ordinary channels of modern life can be seized by something unknown and turned against certainty itself. Number 7. The Mary Celeste. Some dark events become legends because the violence is visible, but others become more powerful because the violence, if it existed at all, vanished completely and left only absence behind. The Mary Celeste belongs to that older and more enduring category of maritime mystery. In 1872, the merchant brigantine was discovered adrift in the Atlantic Ocean in a condition that made the case unforgettable. The ship itself was still afloat, much of its cargo remained aboard, and yet the crew had vanished. No sign of open battle, no obvious explanation, and no clear narrative of panic seemed large enough to account for what had happened. That is what gave the case its extraordinary force. It was not simply a missing person event at sea. It was a complete evacuation of human presence from a vessel that should still have held life. The image is what keeps the mystery alive. An empty ship is one of the most haunting things the human mind can imagine, because a ship is not meant to be empty while still intact. It is a moving world, a floating structure of labor, routine, and dependence. And when that human center disappears, the result feels unnatural, even if the cause may have been entirely mundane. The Mary Celeste became legendary because the vessel seemed to preserve the form of normality while removing its living core. Food, equipment, and order remained in ways that made the absence harder, not easier to understand. It felt as though the sea had taken the people and left their shell behind. Over the years, many explanations have been proposed. Weather, fear of explosion, navigational error, panic over fumes from cargo, equipment issues, and lifeboat departure all offer plausible pieces of a natural solution. In fact, the mystery likely survives not because no explanation exists, but because every explanation remains partly reconstructive. No witness remained aboard to narrate the decision that mattered most, and once that final decision is lost, the imagination fills the silence. That is how maritime cases become modern legends. The ocean removes the decisive human testimony and replaces it with environment, object, and speculation. The result is not a lack of evidence, but a different kind of evidence, material enough to provoke endless theory and incomplete enough to prevent emotional closure. What keeps the Mary Celeste haunting is that it turns the sea into an accomplice of uncertainty. It reminds us that water can erase action while preserving aftermath, and that this combination is often more disturbing than visible destruction. A shipwreck tells one story, an empty ship tells too many. The Mary Celeste remains powerful because it represents one of the purest forms of historical unease, a world built for human survival and movement found continuing without the humans who gave it purpose. Even if the truth was a tragic chain of rational decisions made under pressure, the emotional structure of the case remains untouched. The ship drifted on, the people did not. And that gap between vessel and crew is exactly where modern legend began. Number 6. The Tunguska event. Some dark events become legendary because someone survives to describe the horror, but others become legendary because the scale of what happened was so immense that even without a conventional mystery creature, crime, or disappearance, the event still feels as though the modern world briefly collided with something beyond ordinary comprehension. The Tunguska event belongs to that category of awe mixed with dread. In 1908, a massive explosion devastated a remote area of Siberia, flattening vast stretches of forest with a force so extreme that the landscape itself became the witness. That is what gave the event its enduring power. There was destruction on an enormous scale, yet no conventional impact crater appeared in the way many people expected, and for years the absence of a simple visual answer allowed speculation to spread into every available gap. What makes Tunguska so haunting is the image of violence without a familiar body. Forests were torn down, shockwaves travelled outward, and the natural world was marked by something vast. But the event refused to leave behind the kind of clean object people wanted to point to. A meteor seems easier to understand when it ends as a stone in the ground. Tunguska instead produced a different kind of unease, the sense that an immense force had entered the Earth's atmosphere, unleashed destruction, and then largely vanished into interpretation. That is precisely the kind of structure from which modern legends grow. The physical evidence is undeniable, but the missing clarity invites the imagination to keep working long after science has advanced. Over time, natural explanations became far more persuasive, especially the idea of an airburst caused by an incoming space object that exploded before reaching the ground. That framework explains much of the event and is the strongest way to understand it. But what keeps Tunguska alive in the darker corners of public imagination is that even a scientific explanation does not make the human response feel small. The event remains emotionally overwhelming because it reveals how fragile certainty becomes when something from beyond the earth enters our world with catastrophic force. Rational cause does not erase mythic impact. In some cases, it intensifies it, because the truth itself is already large enough to feel unreal. What keeps the Tunguska event haunting is that it exposed a very modern fear long before most people were ready to think in those terms. The sky was not only weather, distance, or light. It was also a direction from which annihilation could arrive suddenly, without warning, and without human control. The event survives as modern legend because it stands at the border between scientific reality and apocalyptic imagination. It was not supernatural, and yet it felt almost biblical in scale. A forest was levelled, the cause descended from above, and history was left with an event that remains terrifying, not because we know nothing, but because what we know is already enough to make the world feel less secure. Number 5. The Somerton Man. Some dark events become legendary because the violence is obvious, while others become legendary because the silence surrounding one human being becomes so complete that identity itself begins to feel haunted. The Somerton Man belongs to that second and more intimate category of modern mystery. In 1948, the body of an unidentified man was found on Somerton Beach in Australia, neatly dressed, carrying few useful clues, and surrounded by details so strange that the case quickly passed beyond the boundaries of an ordinary, unidentified death. What gave it such enduring force was not only the unknown name, but the atmosphere of coded meaning attached to the body. The mysterious scrap of paper, the unanswered questions about travel, the possibility of poison, and the unsettling sense that this man had died, carrying a private story that the world could see only in fragments. That structure is what makes the case so powerful. A nameless dead person already creates unease because identity is one of the most basic forms of order modern society promises to preserve. When someone dies and cannot be named, a gap opens in the system people trust. But the Somerton Man case went further than anonymity. It seemed to hint at concealment, intention, and perhaps even espionage, or at least a life lived in ways not easily traceable. The body was present, but the person remained absent. That tension between physical reality and personal disappearance is exactly where modern legends flourish. The mystery does not only concern cause of death, it concerns the possibility that someone can pass through the modern world, leave a body behind, and still remain partly inaccessible to history. The case also endured because of the strange objects and details orbiting it. The scrap bearing the words Tamam Shud, the coded notes, the unanswered associations, and the uncertainty over whether the death was suicide, murder, accident, or something more covert, all contributed to the same atmosphere of incompletion. Every element seemed to offer a clue while withholding resolution. That matters because modern legends often grow not from total absence of evidence, but from evidence that feels deliberately broken, as though the truth is present in pieces, but refuses to reassemble itself. The Somerton man became one of those rare cases where the smallest details acquired enormous symbolic weight, because there was so little else strong enough to stabilize the story. What keeps the Somerton man haunting is that the case reduces the modern individual to a paradox. The body is found, photographed, examined, and discussed, yet the person remains partly unclaimed by certainty. Even as later efforts moved the mystery closer to possible identification, the emotional structure of the case has remained powerful because for decades it stood as one of the clearest examples of how completely someone could vanish into ambiguity even in the recorded 20th century. It remains disturbing not only because a man died alone on a beach, but because the event suggested that identity, motive, and final truth can all recede together, leaving behind a face, a body, and a mystery that history keeps circling without ever fully putting to rest. Number 4, the Hinterkaifeck murders. Some dark events become legendary because they are mysterious, but others become legendary because the mystery is inseparable from an atmosphere so oppressive that even the known facts feel contaminated by it. The Hinterkaifeck murders belong to that darker category of historical horror. In 1922, 6 people were killed on an isolated farmstead in Bavaria, and what followed transformed the crime from a brutal family massacre into one of the most disturbing unresolved cases in modern European history. The isolation of the farm, the strange reports before the murders, and the deeply unsettling details afterward gave the case a quality that feels almost too complete in its dread. It is not merely a crime remembered for violence. It is a crime remembered because the setting itself seems to have absorbed and preserved fear. What gives Hinterkaifeck such enduring power is that the horror did not end cleanly with the murders themselves. The farm did not immediately become an empty crime scene in the ordinary sense. There were signs that someone may have remained there after the killings, using the property, feeding animals, and moving through the ordinary routines of rural life while the dead lay nearby. That detail alone is enough to make the case feel uniquely disturbing. Murder is terrifying, but murder followed by occupation is something darker. It suggests not only violence, but a kind of intimate control over the aftermath, as though the killer did not merely destroy a household but entered into possession of its silence. Few details in criminal history are more psychologically corrosive than that. The setting intensifies everything. An isolated farm is already a place built on routine, repetition, and separation from outside help, and once violence enters that kind of landscape, it becomes much harder to imagine safety returning. Reports of strange footprints in the snow, unusual sounds, and a general sense of unease before the crime have helped give the case its legendary aura, whether or not each detail can bear the full weight later retellings placed upon it. That is how modern legends form around real crimes. The boundary between documented fact and remembered atmosphere begins to blur, but instead of weakening the case, that blur often makes it more powerful. The known facts are already terrible enough. The shadow around them only deepens the effect. What keeps the Hinterkaifeck murders haunting is that they represent one of the most intimate forms of historical terror. This was not violence erupting in a public square or vanishing into a city crowd. It happened in a household, in a place built for shelter, labor, and family continuity, and it left behind the suggestion that warning signs had existed without becoming rescue. That is why the case remains so difficult to forget. It is not only unresolved, it feels enclosed, as though the farm itself became a sealed chamber of dread that history never fully opened again. The murders remain powerful because they expose a truth more unsettling than folklore. Sometimes the most terrifying legends are born not from the supernatural, but from the fact that a real place, a real family, and a real sequence of events can become so dark that explanation never feels strong enough to restore the world around them. Number 3. The Elisa case. Some dark events become legendary because they begin in isolation, but others become legendary because they are captured by the modern world in exactly the wrong way, through fragments of image and timing that seem to invite endless interpretation without ever granting certainty. The Elisa Lam case belongs to that uniquely contemporary category of modern legend. In 2013, the disappearance and death of Elisa Lam at the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles became internationally infamous, not only because of the tragedy itself, but because of the elevator footage that entered public consciousness and transformed the case into something far larger than an ordinary investigation. That footage, showing behavior many viewers found erratic, fearful, or impossible to read, became the emotional center of the mystery. Once people saw it, the case no longer lived only in police timelines or forensic questions. It began living in replay. That is what gave the event such unusual force. Modern legends often grow when the public receives an image strong enough to feel revelatory and ambiguous enough to remain permanently unstable. The elevator video did exactly that. It offered movement without context, fear without visible cause, and gestures without explanation. People watched it over and over, searching for hidden pursuers, altered states, supernatural threat, or signs of psychological collapse, and each interpretation fed the next. The modern world is supposed to feel clarified by footage, but in this case the footage acted more like a machine for producing unease. It showed something real and yet seemed incapable of settling what that reality meant. The hotel setting deepened the legend almost immediately. The Cecil already carried a reputation shaped by urban darkness, history, and public fascination, which meant the case entered an environment already prepared to absorb it into a mythology of dread. That matters because location often shapes the afterlife of real events. A tragedy in a neutral space may remain a tragedy. A tragedy in a place already burdened by atmosphere can become something else, a narrative magnet for speculation, projection, and supernatural reinterpretation. The Elisa Lam case became one of the clearest examples of this process in the internet age. The facts of the investigation existed, but they had to compete with a visual fragment and a setting strong enough to turn uncertainty into folklore almost immediately. What keeps the Elisa Lam case haunting is not simply that it remains sad or strange. It is that it revealed how a documented modern death can be transformed into legend by the combination of image, environment, and public obsession. Even where later explanations brought elements of the case closer to tragic human reality, the emotional structure created by the footage never disappeared. The event remains disturbing because it feels like a collision between private suffering and public myth-making, a moment where the camera appeared to capture the threshold of something terrible without ever fully telling us what that thing was. That is why the case endures. It belongs to the modern world of hotels, surveillance, and viral replay, and yet it still feels as though something essential about it was swallowed by the wrong kind of silence. Number 2, the Flannan Isles, lighthouse mystery. Some dark events become legendary because the violence is visible, but others become legendary because nothing visible remains except the silence left behind. The Flannan Isles lighthouse mystery belongs to that colder and more elemental category of historical dread. In December 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers stationed on the remote Flannan Isles off the coast of Scotland vanished without a trace, leaving behind a site that appeared orderly enough to deepen the mystery rather than dissolve it. There was no clear scene of struggle, no simple account of departure, and no surviving witness to explain how 3 experienced men could disappear together from one of the loneliest outposts in the modern world. That is what gave the case such unusual force. The event did not merely remove people, it removed the human center from a place built entirely around human vigilance. What makes the mystery so haunting is the setting itself. A lighthouse is supposed to represent warning, control, and endurance against the sea, a point of fixed order standing against chaos. When something goes wrong inside that structure, the symbolism becomes almost too perfect. The very place meant to guard others against danger becomes the site of its own unspoken disappearance. The Flannan Isles intensify that effect even further. Rock, wind, Atlantic water, isolation, and harsh weather create an environment already charged with exposure and vulnerability. In such a place, absence is not neutral. It feels active, as if the sea and the island together have erased a sequence of events history was never meant to reconstruct completely. Explanations have long centered on natural causes, especially the possibility that one or more keepers went outside in dangerous weather, another followed, and a rogue wave or catastrophic accident took them all. That explanation is plausible and may well be the closest the case can come to truth. But what keeps the Flannan mystery alive is that the event resists emotional closure even when reason seems strong. The details surrounding the empty station, the missing men, and the inability to recover them turn a likely accident into something far darker in memory. Modern legends often survive not because the probable answer is weak, but because the probable answer still leaves the imagination unsatisfied. A wave may explain the disappearance, but it cannot fully erase the eerie fact that 3 men went missing from the edge of the world and left behind only a place still waiting for them to return. What keeps the Flannan Isles lighthouse mystery haunting is that it compresses the oldest maritime fear into one silent modern scene. The sea does not always need to wreck a ship or leave a body in order to feel victorious. Sometimes it only needs to take the people and leave the structure standing. That reversal is what gives the case such power. The lighthouse remained. The men did not. And in that surviving tower of stone and machinery, modern history inherited one of its purest legends of disappearance, a story in which the wind, the sea, and the isolation seem to have collaborated in removing not only lives, but explanation itself. Number 1. The Dyatlov Pass. Incident. Some dark events become legendary because they are shocking, but others become legendary because every attempt to explain them seems to leave behind a residue of unease too strong to disappear. The Dyatlov Pass incident stands at number 1 because no other case on this list so completely merges documented reality, human tragedy, hostile landscape, and lasting uncertainty into one enduring modern nightmare. In 1959, a group of experienced hikers died in the northern Ural Mountains under circumstances so strange that the case quickly passed beyond an ordinary disaster and into the territory of historical obsession. The tent, the injuries, the flight into freezing darkness, the missing context that should have connected one fact to the next, all of it combined to create a mystery that never felt proportionate to any single explanation. That is what gave Dyatlov its unmatched power. It was not merely a fatal expedition. It was a scene in which survival itself seemed to have collapsed in the wrong order. What makes the incident so haunting is that the evidence appears real, physical, and close enough to understanding that the mind cannot stop trying to force it into coherence. The hikers were not fictional figures in a legend. They were young people with names, photographs, plans, and ordinary expedition routines preserved in notes and film. That intimacy matters because it makes the final break with order even more disturbing. The images taken before the disaster still carry the atmosphere of ordinary life in the wilderness, and because of that, the later facts feel like an intrusion into a reality that should have continued normally. The tent was cut from the inside. Bodies were found scattered across the snow. Some injuries seemed severe, some details felt incomplete, and the mountain itself offered no witness but weather. Modern legends grow strongest when documentation and incomprehension advance together, and Dyatlov is perhaps the clearest example of that pattern in recent history. Many explanations have been proposed across the decades. Avalanche-related scenarios, extreme environmental pressure, infrasound, panic, military speculation, and various stranger theories have all taken their turn inside public imagination. More recent investigation has pushed the case closer to naturalistic understanding, and that movement matters. But even where explanation becomes more persuasive, Dyatlov retains a unique emotional force because the event still feels larger than the answer. The landscape remains too empty, the night too cold, the sequence too fractured. A mystery becomes especially powerful when reason may account for the mechanism but cannot fully absorb the terror. Dyatlov continues to disturb because even if the cause was natural, the human experience of it must have been catastrophic in a way that the surviving evidence can only hint at. What makes the Dyatlov Pass incident worthy of the #1 place is that it represents the purest modern form of historical dread, a real event in a real landscape, involving real people, with enough evidence to preserve obsession and not enough to restore peace. It is not only the question of what happened, it is the sense that the mountain itself became the custodian of a final truth no investigation could fully retrieve. That is why the case endures. It stands at the border between explanation and myth, where the modern world has documented the outline of disaster but not its final inner logic. Dyatlov remains powerful because it reminds us that even in an age of records, reports, and reconstruction, nature can still produce an event so severe, so fragmented, and so resistant to emotional closure that history begins to treat it like folklore while knowing, all the while, that it was horribly real.